The rain was pouring heavily that night, draping the small town streets in a cold, gray veil. Trevor, a 24-year-old black man, was locking up the small gas station where he worked. His face bore the exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours on their feet, but there was something more, the constant worry about his mother, who he knew was waiting for him at home. As he prepared to face the long bus ride back, the sputtering sound of a failing engine caught his attention. Just a few yards away, a luxury car sat stalled on the shoulder, its hood propped open. Beside it stood a middle-aged man, futilely wrestling with an umbrella, his face etched with irritation and frustration. Trevor hesitated for a moment. He could just walk away. It wasn't his problem, and the man, clearly a millionaire, could easily call for a tow truck. But something inside him urged him to help. Maybe it was the way his mother had always taught him, if you can help, then help, even if no one sees you. He walked toward the man, who didn't even notice his approach. "Sir, do you need some help?" Trevor asked, his voice calm but steady. The man looked up, sizing him up with a glance filled with skepticism and irritation. "You? Are you sure you know what you're doing? Don't waste my time." The words cut like a knife. Trevor swallowed hard but kept his composure. Without a word, he began inspecting the engine, quickly identifying the issue. He worked silently while the man grumbled about how nobody seemed competent anymore. When he finished, Trevor stepped back and said simply, "It's fixed. Try starting it now." The man did as he was told, and the engine roared back to life. He scoffed. "That's the least you could do, isn't it? No thank you, no acknowledgement, just the sound of the car speeding off into the rain." Trevor stood there, drenched, but with a strange sense of peace. He didn't know it yet, but this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. The next day, while Trevor was restocking shelves at the gas station, the screech of expensive tires drew his attention. It was the same man from the night before, Mr. Bradley, stepping out of a gleaming limousine with that unmistakable air of disdain. His movements were brisk, his posture rigid, like a man always carrying the weight of being in control. "You're the guy who worked on my car last night, right?" His tone was sharp, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Trevor nodded slightly, refusing to be intimidated. "Well, the car's making weird noises now. Did you actually fix something, or did you just make it worse?" Trevor took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to snap back. "I can check it again, sir. It doesn't sound like anything major." Mr. Bradley crossed his arms, his gaze dripping with mistrust and condescension. "Do you even know what you're doing? These cars aren't some beat-up junkers. Your paycheck probably couldn't even cover the steering wheel." The words landed like stones in the quiet atmosphere. A few customers whispered among themselves, but no one stepped in. Trevor stayed calm, even as his heart pounded in his chest. He had no time for arguments. Without another word, he grabbed his tools and opened the hood. Carefully and methodically, he worked while Mr. Bradley stood nearby, watching him like a hawk waiting for a misstep. After a few minutes, Trevor adjusted a loose cable and stepped back. "It's done, sir. You can test it now." Mr. Bradley climbed into the car and turned the key. The engine purred smoothly. He let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "You got lucky this time." Without so much as a nod of gratitude, he sped off, splashing a puddle that soaked Trevor's shoes in the process. As Trevor dried his feet with an old rag, an older customer who had been watching the scene approached him. "Son, you've got a patience I could never muster. How do you put up with all this?" Trevor shrugged, still wiping his shoes. "My mom always says you don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes, you just do what's right and move on." The customer studied him quietly for a moment, as if weighing those words. But what Trevor didn't know was that someone inside that limousine had seen everything. And what they witnessed would change his life in ways he could never imagine. That same night, Trevor arrived home to his small apartment on the outskirts of town, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft hum of an old radio playing in the background. His mother, Clara, was sitting in a worn-out armchair, a blanket draped over her knees, and a gentle smile on her face that tried to hide the fatigue in her eyes. Trevor knew that smile was her way of concealing the pain she endured daily. "How was work today, son?" Clara asked as she folded a piece of clothing she insisted on mending, despite lacking the strength for it. Trevor hesitated for a moment but decided not to mention the incident with Mr. Bradley. "It was fine, Mom." "Pretty slow, nothing special," he said with a reassuring tone. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, glancing at the nearly empty refrigerator. Clara's small pension barely covered her medication, and Trevor's paycheck was stretched thin, covering the essentials, bills, groceries, and her medical treatments. Every penny was carefully accounted for. "Did you take your evening medication yet?" he asked, returning to the living room. Clara averted her eyes, pretending not to hear. "Mom, please," Trevor said, picking up the bottle of pills from the table and handing her a glass of water. Clara finally accepted but not without a sigh. "You do so much for me, Trevor. I wish you didn't have to carry this burden so young." "This isn't a burden, Mom. It's just life. We do what we can." He smiled, trying to ease her worries, but inside, he felt the weight pressing down on him more each day. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep, Trevor sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pen. He was crunching numbers, searching for any way to save more. His eyes were heavy, but he pushed through, determined. There was no room for dreams or distractions. His priority was ensuring his mother had everything she needed. Yet, the encounter with Mr. Bradley lingered in his mind. It wasn't the humiliation that bothered him but the coldness of a man who had everything and still seemed incapable of showing the slightest empathy. Trevor stared out the window at the distant city lights, wondering if his life would ever change. But he quickly shook off the thought, he didn't have time for such indulgences. The clock struck nearly midnight and Trevor finally turned off the light and lay down on the old mattress in the living room. Before closing his eyes, he glanced at his mother's bedroom door. "As long as I'm here, she'll never go without," he thought, letting exhaustion finally take over. What Trevor didn't know was that, elsewhere in the city, someone was thinking about him, and that thought would set off a chain of events he could never have imagined. 2 days later, Trevor was fueling a customer's car when he heard the unmistakable sound of expensive tires on asphalt. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The sleek black limousine pulled up slowly near the gas station entrance, and Mr. Bradley stepped out with the same impatient air as before. This time, though, there was something different. His steps were less confident, and his face, though still proud, bore a hint of discomfort. Trevor wiped his hands on his worn jeans and approached. Before he could say anything, Mr. Bradley got straight to the point. "My car, there's another issue. The suspension feels off. I don't know if it's something you did before, but now it's like this." Trevor took a deep breath, pushing down the frustration that flared up at the memory of their last interaction. He could have refused to help, but that wasn't who he was. "I can take a look, sir." As Trevor worked, the silence between them was palpable. Mr. Bradley seemed restless, glancing around as if he wanted to be anywhere else. At one point, he watched Trevor's skilled hands and asked, almost casually, "Have you always worked here?" Without looking up from the part he was inspecting, Trevor replied, "Yes, sir. Since I was 18. It's honest work, and it helps me take care of my mom." The mention of Trevor's mother seemed to stir something in Mr. Bradley, but he quickly averted his gaze. When Trevor finished the adjustment, he stepped back and asked Mr. Bradley to test the car. The engine started smoothly, and the suspension felt perfect. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Mr. Bradley hesitated before speaking, an unusual moment for a man who always seemed to have an answer for everything. "Well, you did a good job." The words came out grudgingly, but they were there, a faint glimmer of acknowledgement. Trevor, however, wasn't expecting praise. He replied simply, "I just do my best, sir." Before getting back into his car, Mr. Bradley looked at Trevor differently this time, as though he wanted to say something more but chose not to. The limousine drove off, disappearing into traffic. Trevor returned to his work, brushing off the brief encounter, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Far away, inside the car, Mr. Bradley sat deep in thought. He couldn't ignore Trevor's calm demeanor and the dignity with which he handled every situation, even when faced with constant challenges. And that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The next morning, as Trevor was finishing up cleaning the gas station before opening, he heard the sound of a car pulling in. It wasn't a busy hour yet, so he found it odd. When he looked, he saw the same black limousine as always. This time, however, Mr. Bradley didn't get out right away. He stayed inside for a moment, as if summoning the courage for something. Trevor approached slowly, still holding a rag in his hand. When Mr. Bradley finally stepped out, his expression was different. He seemed less rigid, almost human. "Trevor, I need a favor," he began, his tone low, devoid of its usual arrogance. Trevor raised an eyebrow, surprised. He never imagined hearing those words from this man. "Sure, sir. What do you need?" Mr. Bradley averted his gaze for a moment before continuing. "It's about my son, Ethan. He's going through a tough time, and I don't know how to handle it. I've seen how calm you are, how patient. I thought maybe you could help." The confession felt almost uncomfortable for Mr. Bradley, as though asking for help was something he rarely, if ever, did. Trevor, on the other hand, didn't quite know how to respond. He was used to helping people, but this was different. Still, it wasn't in his nature to refuse. "If you think I can help, sir, I'm willing to try. But what exactly do you need me to do?" "I want you to spend some time with him. Talk to him. Show him. I don't know, that there are other ways to see life." The frankness of the request was unexpected, almost desperate. Trevor realized that behind the arrogant exterior was a father trying, even if clumsily, to do the right thing. At first, Trevor was hesitant. He had his own responsibilities, his mother depended on him, and spending time with the son of a man who had treated him so poorly seemed absurd. But then he remembered what his mother always said, "Sometimes, the best help you can give is just being there." "All right, sir. I'll do what I can," Trevor said, his voice calm but resolute. Mr. Bradley looked relieved but still hesitant. He handed Trevor an envelope. "Here's something for your time. I don't expect you to do this for free." Trevor glanced at the envelope for a moment before refusing it. "I'm not doing this for the money, sir. If I'm helping, it's because I believe I can make a difference." For a brief moment, Mr. Bradley was at a loss for words. He returned to his limousine and left without saying anything more. Trevor stood there, watching the taillights disappear. He didn't know exactly what he was getting himself into, but something told him this would be more than just a favor. On Saturday morning, Trevor arrived at Mr. Bradley's massive house. It wasn't the kind of place he usually visited. The automatic gate opened slowly, revealing a long driveway bordered by a meticulously maintained garden. Trevor walked in with steady steps, but he couldn't help feeling the weight of being in a world so different from his own. A housekeeper greeted him with a polite smile and led him to a living room that felt larger than his entire apartment. A few minutes later, Ethan came down the stairs. The teenager was 16, with messy hair, expensive clothes worn carelessly, and a look of pure defiance. "So, you're the new friend my dad brought in to give me a lecture?" Ethan asked, crossing his arms. His tone was a mix of rebellion and insecurity. Trevor took a deep breath. He knew this wouldn't be easy. "Actually, your dad asked me to talk to you, but I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to understand what's going on." Ethan let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "Understand what?" That he's an absent father who only cares about his company? You don't need long to figure that out. The teenager's words carried a pain that Trevor recognized instantly. He knew what it was like to grow up feeling like no one was truly there for you. He decided not to push. Why don't we go outside for a bit? I don't want to sit in this room where you probably feel like you're being watched all the time, Trevor suggested, gesturing toward the backyard. Surprised by the direct approach, Ethan hesitated before agreeing. They went out to the garden, where a bench sat under the shade of a tree. The conversation started slow, almost like a game of question and answer. Ethan resisted every attempt Trevor made to connect, but Trevor wasn't easily deterred. So, what do you like to do in your free time? Trevor asked casually. Free time? Ethan replied, laughing again, but this time with less bitterness. I spend half my time trying not to lose it with the guys at school and the other half playing video games. Not much else. Trevor chuckled softly. Well, gaming isn't so bad. I used to play when I was younger, but I had to stop because of work. Maybe you can teach me a thing or two. Trevor's light-hearted response caught Ethan off guard, and the boy lowered his defenses slightly. For the first time, he felt he didn't have to protect himself from someone who genuinely wanted to understand him. When Mr. Bradley appeared on the veranda, watching the scene from a distance, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, Ethan talking to someone without anger or sarcasm. The man stood there silently, and something within him began to shift. Trevor, meanwhile, knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't in a hurry. He understood that trust was built slowly, one step at a time. Days later, Trevor was called back to the Bradley house. This time, he didn't find Ethan in the garden or the living room. When he asked one of the staff, he was told that father and son were in the office, arguing. Trevor hesitated for a moment but decided to wait near the slightly ajar door. The voices from inside were loud, filled with anger and pain. You don't even know who I really am, Dad. You've never been there. Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. And what do you want me to do, Ethan? Give up everything I've built just to coddle you? You don't understand what responsibility means. Mr. Bradley retorted, his voice sharp but laced with desperation. Trevor stood still for a few seconds but couldn't hold back. He knocked on the door, interrupting the confrontation. When both turned to look at him, their expressions were different. Ethan's face showed gratitude, as if relieved that someone had broken the heavy tension, while Mr. Bradley's expression was more one of annoyance, as if silently questioning Trevor's presence. Sorry to interrupt, but could I talk to both of you? Trevor asked, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. Mr. Bradley sighed, still irritated, but stepped back and gestured toward a chair across the room. Ethan flopped onto the sofa, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know exactly what's going on between you two, Trevor began, looking at them both, but what I do know is that sometimes, the problem isn't what we say but how we say it. He paused, searching for the right words. Ethan, I understand your frustration. Sometimes it feels like no one really sees us. But yelling isn't going to make your dad hear you better. He turned to Mr. Bradley. And sir, I know you have a lot on your plate. But your son doesn't need perfection, he just needs to feel like he's important to you. A heavy silence fell over the room. Ethan looked up at his father, but his gaze was filled with doubt. Mr. Bradley, on the other hand, seemed on the verge of saying something but stopped, as if processing everything. Trevor knew he couldn't solve everything right then and there. So he stood up and said, I'll give you both some time to think. When you're ready, I'll be outside. He stepped out into the garden and sat on the bench under the same tree where he'd first spoken to Ethan. The soft breeze carried a fresh air that contrasted with the tension inside the house. After a few minutes, Ethan appeared. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to Trevor. Do you think he'll ever understand me? Ethan asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Trevor looked at him. If you give him a chance, and if he gives you a chance, I think he will. But it takes time. Inside the house, Mr. Bradley remained in the office, alone. He stared at an old photo of Ethan as a child, taken during the one vacation they had ever shared. For the first time in years, he wondered, where did I go wrong? That evening, Trevor was invited to dinner at the Bradley house. He hesitated to accept but eventually agreed, realizing he could help Ethan feel less isolated. When he arrived, he could sense the tension in the air. The dining table was large and luxurious, set with dishes that looked like they came from a five-star restaurant, but the silence was almost oppressive. Ethan arrived late, clearly making a point of showing his disinterest. He tossed his backpack into a corner and sat down with a closed-off expression. Mr. Bradley, already seated at the head of the table, shot him a stern look but said nothing. Trevor, seated next to Ethan, observed the dynamic silently, trying to piece it together. "Ethan, it would be nice if you at least tried to be on time," Mr. Bradley finally said, his tone more of a command than a remark. Ethan scoffed and began scrolling through his phone. "What difference does it make? You just want me here to pretend we're some perfect family." Trevor noticed that Ethan's words were filled with hurt, but also a deep need to be heard. Mr. Bradley, however, didn't seem ready to listen. "I just want you to show some respect, Ethan. That's the bare minimum." "Respect?" Ethan's head shot up, his eyes blazing with anger. "How do you expect respect when you've never been here? Do you think money solves everything? It doesn't, Dad. It never did." The silence that followed was crushing. Trevor, sensing the situation was about to spiral, decided to step in. "Hey, let's take a breath. I think everyone here wants the same thing, but maybe this isn't the best way to say it." He turned to Ethan. "I know you're hurt, but have you ever told him how you feel? Without yelling, just saying it the way you want to be heard?" Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his rebellious front or letting his guard down. Mr. Bradley, for his part, seemed uncomfortable but didn't interrupt. Trevor continued, "And Mr. Bradley, maybe listening to what Ethan has to say without cutting him off would be a good start." Ethan crossed his arms and glanced at his father, who looked away for a moment before finally speaking, though with less harshness. "I'm not perfect, Ethan. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying. It's just hard when you won't give me a chance." Ethan stayed quiet, clearly affected but unwilling to show it. Trevor saw the small crack in the boy's armor and decided that was enough progress for one night. "How about we save the rest of this for another time? It might be easier when everyone's calmer." The rest of the dinner continued in a quieter, less tense atmosphere. Both Mr. Bradley and Ethan seemed lost in their thoughts, but for the first time, there was a sense that something was shifting. Trevor didn't have all the answers, but he knew that small, consistent actions could mend even the deepest conflicts. For now, that was enough. A few days later, as Trevor was cleaning the service area at the gas station, a black limousine pulled in slowly. He immediately recognized Mr. Bradley's car, but what caught his attention was the back door opening to reveal someone else. A well-dressed man, lacking Bradley's usual arrogance, stepped out and walked toward Trevor with a purposeful stride. "You must be Trevor," the man said, offering a faint smile that felt out of place in the setting. "That's me." "And you are?" Trevor replied, his surprise evident. "My name is Charles. I've worked with Mr. Bradley for years, but I think you've seen me before. I was in the car the day you helped him for the first time. I saw everything that happened." Trevor remained silent, trying to process this unexpected encounter. Charles continued, "That day, your composure impressed me. You were insulted in a way no one should ever be, but you held your dignity. It made me think, a lot more than I expected." Trevor furrowed his brow, still unsure of the purpose of this visit. Sensing the confusion, Charles smiled more warmly. "I'm here because I want to help. I spoke to Mr. Bradley about you, about your story and everything you do for your mother. He's not an easy man to convince, but for the first time, someone managed to make him stop and listen. It was Charles who urged Mr. Bradley to take a closer look at Trevor and see that he wasn't just another worker. He shared stories about Trevor's late nights at the station, his relentless efforts to care for his mother, and, most importantly, the strength of character he displayed, even in the face of adversity. Charles handed Trevor a large, sealed envelope and simply said, "This is for you. It's from Mr. Bradley. I don't know if you've realized it, but you've changed something in him," Charles added. "And now, I'm here to ensure he follows through on what he promised. The house, care for your mother, and more than that, to make sure you get the recognition you deserve." Trevor stood silent for a moment, taking it all in. "I didn't do anything expecting something in return, Charles," he finally said. "But if this helps my mother, then I'm grateful. Truly grateful." Charles placed a firm hand on Trevor's shoulder. "You've done more than you realize, not just for Mr. Bradley, but for people like me, who need examples like yours. Keep being who you are, Trevor." Before Trevor could ask any questions, Charles turned and walked away. Confused, Trevor opened the envelope on the spot. Inside was an official document and a small handwritten note. The handwriting was firm but awkward, as if the writer wasn't accustomed to expressing emotions on paper. "Trevor, I'm not a man of many words, but I've seen enough to understand how much you sacrifice for the ones you love. Use this to take care of your mother and yourself. It's the least I can do for someone like you. With respect, Bradley." Trevor unfolded the document. It was an official transfer of ownership for a modest but cozy home in a quiet neighborhood. He blinked, stunned. A house. For him and his mother. Later that day, when Trevor returned home, he found Clara resting in her armchair, the late afternoon light streaming into their small apartment. He sat beside her, holding the document carefully. "Mom, we're moving," he said softly. Clara looked at him with surprise, her expression tinged with worry. "What do you mean, Trevor? We can't afford that." He explained everything, his voice calm but still tinged with disbelief. Clara sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You did this, my son. Not by accepting help, but by being who you are. Whatever touched that man's heart, it was your kindness. That's something money can't buy." As she spoke, Trevor felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just about the house, it was about everything that had led up to this moment. Every difficult choice, every time he chose to do the right thing, even when no one seemed to notice. That night, before he fell asleep, Trevor lay staring at the ceiling for a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew something had changed, not just for him and his mother, but for Mr. Bradley, who was beginning to understand that the true measure of a life wasn't in what you owned, but in what you did for those around you. If you want to hear more emotional stories like this one, comment, "I want," and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Stay tuned for another heartwarming story coming next.